Good morning, everybody, and a big welcome to you all for today's DrayTek webinar. Today's webinar is called The End of Analog Phone Lines. I'm Julian Hubble. I'm Sales Director for DrayTek UK and Ireland, and it's my pleasure to present this webinar today. Many of you have been on our webinars previously. We tend to make them sort of very product-oriented and relating to kind of DrayTek product ranges. This is a bit of a different one in that we're talking about what's happening in our industry. We will be referencing some DrayTek products throughout this, but the intention of this is to give you a feel of what's happening in the lead up to the end of analog lines and kind of what it means to everybody. Before we start, I just want to make a few comments about what we've done to pull this information together. So essentially, everything we're presenting today is all publicly available, and we will share all the sources of the core data we've used for this. And the intention today is to share this publicly available information in a concise format, looking at what led us up to this particular moment in time, what we've seen happening, and what the organisations are planning to do that will affect the end of analog lines. I also make the point that the switch off of analog phone lines is likely to take between 3 and 4 years. And obviously 3 and 4 years is quite a long way away. A lot can happen in that time scale. You know, we're in a pandemic, for goodness sake. So you can't absolutely guarantee that everything is going to happen according to what we say today. But I do assure you, everything comes from organisations that are making these changes. And we've done our best to make sure this is as accurate as it possibly can be as of today, 10th of February, 2021. We welcome all your feedback on this. Please feel free to check out the sources and come back to us. We'd love to hear from you. I'll also say that the webinar will be recorded and will be made available for streaming after this presentation. You'll be able to stream this directly from the draytek.co.uk website. I'll just kind of read out this disclaimer as well. Any reference to a potential solution is intended as guidance and does not necessarily mean it is right for your specific situation. You should always check with your service provider and or IT expert before considering implementation or purchase of a product. So what we're going to cover today is firstly a brief history of how we've led up to this position today with some key definitions. So some of the terms and acronyms hopefully will be explained, why there is this need for change right now, and what the key milestones are, A, that have kind of got us to this point, and B, hopefully going to get us to this switching off analog phones in 2025. We'll also talk about the implications of this to businesses, consumers. We'll cover in some depth the key terms and what they mean. Most of us, I think, have got a bit of a sense of what the different broadband technologies are and what they're called. Some of these key names are going to change as we move towards this turning off the analog phone systems. We'll talk a little bit about how best to prepare for this. We'll put some solutions forward as well, some DrayTek, some non-DrayTek, and hopefully by the end of it you'll have a really clear understanding of what's going on, how best to prepare, and what the implication is likely to be. Let's just say right at the end we'll have a Q&A. So let me just first talk about the history and milestones that have led up to this situation today. Well, I think the first thing to say is that the sort of infrastructure that's in the UK, the vast majority of the infrastructure that's in the UK today that we use is really a PSTN network that was installed right up to sort of end of the 20th century. The infrastructure that was originally put in was really designed for voice phone calls, and it's basically analog technology in its first implementation. And it's quite interesting for me actually doing a bit of research on this, because I came into the industry in the 1980s, you know, where typically remote access was 2400 bits per second, going up to 3200 bits per second. For business networks, they used leased lines and modems. I remember when 19.2 kilobits came out, it was considered very fast, hugely expensive, you know, tens of thousands of pounds per year for a leased line, and relatively slow by today's standards. We then saw a bit of a migration to digital with Killerstream and Megastream coming out for business-to-business connections. Again, 2 megabits per second, believe it or not, was considered very fast in those days and incredibly expensive. The main point to make here is that there was a huge infrastructure investment made by BT and actually some other organisations as well, but mainly by BT. And this was really copper cabling that was laid on the ground and on telegraph poles that we see all over the place. And this is basically what is generally known as copper cable twisted pair, which forms the vast array of our infrastructure today. Then as we got to the turn of the 21st century, we saw the growth of digital services. We saw ISDN, integrated services digital network, as the name suggests. This was there to combine both voice and data together. We actually at the time, I remember thinking this was going to be the future. Actually, it was the big thing that everybody's going to start using. The data kind of waned a little bit as it became very expensive and quite tricky to use, but it's still used for voice today, actually, and there are many PBX solutions out there that still use ISDN in various forms. We also saw the first kind of broadband service provided to consumers in the form of ADSL. There was also another variant called SDSL, stands for asymmetrical digital subscriber line. So in other words, one speed down is faster than the speed up, and we'll talk about some of these speeds later on. Faster lease lines were starting to be used for business as the whole thing became more digital. So we saw a growth of digital services, the speeds got faster and faster, but in the main we're still using this kind of copper wire that's in the ground and on telegraph poles. And this came to be known as a bit of a problem, actually, as the last mile link, that last connection to the premise, very expensive to change, lots of it about, based on copper. Then over the last 20 years, we've seen huge increase for faster and faster speeds as the internet's embracing streaming services, social media, demand to be connected anywhere. We all know what the story is there. ISDN became much less used, not so relevant for data, but still used for voice. And we started to see DSL take on another lease of life. And this is really more and more sophisticated technologies that's designed to get the maximum possible out of a copper wire, something that's not really designed for this type of use. And this has basically become a bit of a legacy for us in the UK, as we've got this infrastructure that's not really designed for the fast networks that we demand today. And basically this started to become a political problem. Demand for high-speed networking really outstripped the supply, and UK broadband starts to fall behind other countries. I remember traveling in Scandinavia 15 years ago, where it was not uncommon to get gigabit speeds even then, and we really did feel somewhat behind, and indeed we still are. So over the last 5 years, we have seen some infrastructure in fibre. If you're lucky, you might get fibre to the premise and potentially get gigabit speeds with that fibre connection. But fibre to the street cabinet and then that last mile loop of copper wire is the norm, really. So that last mile loop in the main still remains. The problem in the main still remains for both of us. So as a result of this, if you like, the infrastructure falling behind what's required for these very high-speed networks that we're all starting to demand, the government get involved and they pledged full fibre for everybody by 2025. This was in 2018. I think at the time BT were estimating fibre installations in reality could pass 70% of homes by 2025 based on the current investment. And I know discussions were going on, perhaps are still going on, between BT and government about legislative changes, increased funding, subsidies and so on, to try and put more oomph behind this process. And I think that there was a suggestion that the best case was 90% of homes would have a fibre connection by 2025. I think everybody recognises and acknowledges that this will definitely not be met. Clearly there's a distraction on funding at the moment with the current pandemic. So the extent of homes that will have fibre by 2025 is really, I think, really unknown at this stage. But clearly there's a very, very strong intention to deliver this. So following that announcement in 2018, there was a test site installed, which was Salisbury in 2019, which was the first fibre to the premise test site, first environment. And I'll sort of introduce a term here called FTTP. Many of you will be familiar with that, but that effectively means fibre to the premise. In other words, your home or your business has got a direct fibre connection, giving you access to all that high speed. In 2020, a second test site was put in place. This is Mildenhall. This combines both fibre where possible and also high-speed DSL service. So we've got this concept of fibre to the premise when you've got fibre coming into your premise, and you've got this concept of FDC, or fibre to the street cabinet, with copper from the street cabinet to the premises, FTTC. So that's kind of a bit of whistle-stop tour of how this has all started and where we are today. And this is a little bit of what's going to happen and what is predicted to happen between now and 2025. I'm also going to introduce another term here called wholesale line rental, or WLR, as its abbreviation is. And this is very much a kind of BT term. So if you're on BT websites or you're speaking to people associated with BT, they may use this term. And basically, switching off of analog phone lines is also the same as saying the withdrawal of wholesale line rental. And essentially what is going to happen in June 2021, BT will start to reduce the availability of this wholesale line rental, this traditional analog phone service, this analog phone service that's kind of on the top of the broadband connection that you've got. 120 telephone exchanges initially will no longer accept new orders for BT lines, BT phone lines, and this will rapidly reduce over time. Exactly what and when is going to happen is yet to be determined, but the intention is to streamline this or taper this between June 2021 and 2025. So availability of phones will become increasingly difficult to find. And as I say, this affects all what we call over-the-top services that provided over and above the broadband connection, otherwise known as wholesale line rental. I'll explain a little bit about those later on. So there are some new acronyms to get your head around, I'm afraid. The first one that's going to come into the UK is something called SOTAP. I'll explain what these actually mean a little bit later on, but in September 2021, we'll see the first line offered that will not have an over-the-top asynchronous analog phone line associated with it. This is going to be called SOTAP, and it's going to be associated with what we understood to be ADSL lines. Again, I'll explain what SOTAP means a little bit later on. Effectively, what is happening is that BT Openreach are going to switch off this analog phone service. And for those that you are not aware, BT Openreach is actually not part of BT any longer. You can think of BT Openreach as the organisation responsible for all those physical lines that you see on telegraph poles and in the ground. It's kind of synonymous with National Rail, where you've got obviously the National Rail owning all the rail tracks, and then you've got the operating companies running the rolling stock and engines on top of them. So it's a similar kind of environment there. BT Openreach is a completely separate legal entity from BT. This was an Ofcom requirement, the regulator, to make sure they broke up that monopoly. But it does affect nearly all UK providers of analog phone services. So many ISPs out there that you can buy your services from that will also provide a phone line. This will now not be available to them or any other service provider. So in summary, there will be a phase out of analog phone services over the next 3 to 4 years. However, in 2025, based on the comments I made earlier on, we're probably far from having fibre to the premise for everybody. And so there will still be that mixture of new fibre and legacy copper, otherwise known as XDSL lines, well after that analog phone service is switched off. And this will affect not only single analog lines, but also multiple lines that business might have. Also ISDN2 and ISDN30 will be switched off as well. Mainly affects PBX environments with that sort of older technology. Of course, many of them have gone to IPpbx now, but there are still those out there with ISDN. So that will effectively be switched off. Okay, so let's now look at some of the implications, what this actually means. So we think of this in terms of, hey, that must mean a phone line, which of course it does, but it just doesn't just affect phones. This will affect any analog device that's attached, or any system that's reliant on that analog connection. So, you know, some examples are there. I'm not going to read them all out. You can see them all there, but, you know, EPOS machines in shops, when we can eventually go back to them, you know, we'll have credit card checking, which often will go over an analog line. They'll have to change the way they do things. Fire alarms, you know, certainly a lot of them are now based on IP. Intruder and fire alarms are based on IP, but there's still proprietary systems out there that have an analog connection, or maybe an analog connection as a backup. You know, traffic lights, fax machines, many organisations will have a fax machine still reliant on that analog line, and so on. So there are many implications on this. So, you know, businesses need to consider all the things that are reliant on that analog line, and as you can see there, quite a few things could be affected by it. And when we look at sort of the options that individuals and organisations have, for somebody, you know, like us all, we're at home, a lot of us will use a line, an analog line. But you know, certainly if I speak to my children who are in their sort of late 20s and 30s, and I suppose that like younger generation, if you like, many don't really have the concept of a phone line. Many will use the mobile phone, you know, Skype, WhatsApp, FaceTime, and so on for calls, other types of systems for that sort of multimedia, Teams and Zoom. So, you know, I'm wondering really by the time 2025 comes along, whether certainly maybe it might be a generational thing where some of us that's slightly older may want this actual analog phone line because that's the way we connect with people, that's how they ring us. But for a generation, maybe it's not quite so relevant. And indeed, you know, for any automatic response device, might need upgrading to a digital alternative, and that's a situation there. Individuals should contact their service provider to see what the options are. I'm going to cover this in a little bit more depth later on, but actually, for those of us that probably want to keep our main telephone line even after it's switched off, there is quite a simple way of doing it. The way we do it is you use something called a SIP service, which is the service that effectively converts a normal telephone call on an analog line or other source to be able to communicate across the internet. So effectively using a SIP service, you can make a telephone call, it'll go through the internet and break out onto, as it is the BSTN today, and you can ring a mobile phone or any other phone that might be on the network. So SIP service with your existing analog phone might be the solution. You probably see a picture there, you've got a router with a potential phone line connection to it. So that might be one way of doing it. And there's also an example of a DrayTek router there. Actually, if you look at the bottom right, there's a Viga 2865, our latest business class router recently announced with this phone port on it where you can plug a standard phone. For businesses, they're probably in most cases likely to be much more advanced. Many of them will have ditched the old analog phone lines and will have an IPpbx of some description. Maybe it's an IPpbx that's installed on their premise. Obviously, what is becoming more popular in net today is like cloud-based PBX services, where effectively there's a virtual PBX in the cloud, and you're connecting phones onto it, whether it's a head office, branch office, or home worker. That's very, very commonly in place now. And of course, many of us are now using Teams and Zoom to make connections, so aren't really reliant on that analog phone. So certainly going to affect consumers at home. Will affect business possibly to a lesser extent, but of course businesses that might be using all those other types of devices I mentioned that may have a reliance on the analog phone may well be affected as well. So I'm now going to move on to some of the key terms that we associate with this and what the new offerings kind of look like. So this is a bit of a busy graphic there, but hopefully this depicts in a topological form what we've currently got in place in the network. So if you look at the top, you've got ADSL, ADSL2+. So this was the kind of first generally available broadband service that came around the turn of the century. As you can see here, you've got the concept of a telephone exchange. You've then got a connection to the green street cabinet we see on many street corners. We've then got the connection from the street cabinet to the premise. Now, think about ADSL is the connection between the exchange and the cabinet is copper, a copper wire, and then the connection between the cabinet and the premise is also copper. This means that there's a very long copper connection between the exchange and the premise. A long copper connection means that there's quite a lot of interference on that line, which means that it's very difficult to pump very high speeds across that. So that's why you tend to get low speed with ADSL 2+. Next one down, we've got VDSL. This was the next one up that many of us have now got. Key thing here is that the connection between the exchange and the street cabinet is now a fibre connection. And this is where the term fibre to the cabinet, or FTTC, kind of came from. So if you've got an FTTC service, you've got a nice high-speed link between the exchange and the cabinet. Then, of course, the connection between the street cabinet and the premise is copper, where, again, you've got the underlying issue with that particular medium not being ideally suited to fast data. So VDSL has now become G.fast, which is the latest and greatest, probably G.last, I might call it, because maybe that's the last attempt to get the absolute maximum out of a copper connection. Might be wrong on that, but that's kind of how it appears to me. Some of us are starting to get that now. And then we go below that line, we can see fibre to the premise, where it's a fibre connection from the exchange right the way through to the premise. Then below that, we've got classically what you might see on Virgin Media, where you've actually got a coaxial connection to your home with a DOCSIS node, fibre to the exchange to that DOCSIS node, and then coax. And then finally, many of us are using this. You've got that concept of mobile broadband. Could be 4G or LTE, as it's sometimes called. There are also many wireless networks out there that don't use 4G to provide outlying regions such as villages and so on. And I was on one of those myself at one stage. So essentially, those are the sort of different styles of broadband that are commonly available. I've probably not covered them all. There's also satellite and probably one or two others. So apologies, I've not included every single one of them, but that I think covers the vast majority that you like to see or like to use today. So just to show which one of these is basically affected. So if you see the top three there that are shaded in grey, these are the services that you, at the moment, get an over-the-top service of the analog line. And just to give you an idea there, so ADSL, that's asymmetric digital subscriber line, meaning fast in one direction for download and slower for upload. The speed there is typically 24 megabits download, 3 megabits upload. You can then see VDSL, stands for very high speed DSL. Don't ask me how they invented these acronyms, but that's what it stands for, very high speed DSL. And that is an 80 megabits download, 20 megabits upload. And then you've got the newer G.fast, which is starting to roll out now, which is fast access to subscriber terminals, or the premise for you and I. Again, a fibre to the cabinet service. Again, utilising the latest and greatest technologies to force as much speed as we possibly can down these last remaining copper connections. And that is a 330 megabit download, 50 megabit upload. Now, as you can see there, all of those three services come with a kind of analog phone line as standard. If you look at the broadband services below, fibre to the premises, FTTP, where you can typically get up to gigabit speeds, and all the other forms of broadband, whether it's satellite broadband, wireless broadband for the villages, LTE broadband, 3G, 4G, and obviously 5G coming down the line. An analog line was never included, so really this switching off of the analog service really doesn't affect those bottom two, but it does majorly affect those top two. And what I'm now going to do is introduce some new terms that hopefully we're all going to become more and more familiar with. So, excuse me that. So if I look at the first one, ADSL, asymmetric digital subscriber line, this will now be supplied, but without that analog line. So that service is now going to be called the single order transitional access product, or SOTAP. And as I've said early on, I did hint at this earlier, this SOTAP service will start to become available from September 2021. So that's the first new kind of acronym to get to know. But actually, looking further down, the concept's actually really quite straightforward. So you've got ADSL without the analog line, and you've got VDSL without the analog line, and of course you've got G.fast without the analog line, and these are all called different things. So ADSL without the analog line, SOTAP. VDSL without the analog line becomes single order generic Ethernet access, or SOGEA. And the G.fast without the analog line becomes single order generic fast, or SOGFast. So some great new acronyms to get your head around. But that's essentially what these services are now going to become. And just kind of moving down, there's really limited change to these other services. FTTP and the other things will remain pretty much the same. Just for ordering fibre to the premises, it's going to be called GEA-FTTP, GEA-fibre to the premises. So I hope that kind of makes things clear. We've got an existing infrastructure, some of which you get this analog line alongside it. Those that you used to get the analog line alongside, that's now going to be discontinued, and you've got these new different styles of service. So we now move on to kind of what this means and how to prepare. Well, first thing to say is clearly we all need to do a bit of a review on the infrastructure we've got and usage. So, you know, do we need these analog phones at home in the office? Do we need to consider, you know, maybe more vulnerable people that have got low tech and maybe are not quite ready to move to this kind of new world? So we've got to think about that. We've got to ask ourselves, is there actually a need for this analog phone line? And if there is, how can this be provided? And consider these voice over IP services, which again I'm going to cover in a little bit more depth before we conclude the presentation. Also, what options might we want to put in place for future proofing? You know, maybe we need to make an infrastructure change, or we need to change our router, or there's something we've got to do because we want higher speeds. Really not sure what's going to happen in a few years' time. So how do we make sure we cover all the bases? That might also be a consideration for us. But I think, you know, the good news here is, you know, ISPs are clearly going to be more than aware of this. They're going to want to be able to provide phone lines to people that want them. And the ISP is most likely to be in contact with us all to let us know what's going on, when changes are going to occur, and what solutions will be in place. And I know, for example, the BT new Home Hub, I'll put a picture of it later on, is already accommodating this. So, you know, hopefully it's not a big panic story. The ISPs will wrap cotton wool around this and make it easy for all of us to make this transition. So just a few scenarios to go through here. So here's somebody, you know, I want my broadband, but I definitely need to keep the phone line. You know, everybody rings me on this phone number. I don't want to change. It really suits me to keep it. So as I said, most ISPs will offer a phone service, but now using a voice over IP solution, or VoIP as the acronym is shortened to. And this combines with a SIP service, which can be combined in the router. So most likely a new router will be required for this that supports this SIP service. So SIP service is a subscribed service that you sign up to. It's configured within the router. And instead of collecting your telephone line to the usual PSTN, you collect your phone connection actually physically to the router. One thing I will say here is it looks like that in most cases the existing telephone number can be retained. So we've got your, in my case, 01525, whatever it might be, number. In most cases you'll be able to retain that. So I think that'd be quite a useful thing for continuity. I've got a couple of examples below. First one on the left there is the latest BT Smart Hub 2. As you can see at the back with a ring around it, you've got a little phone port there. So this effectively means you can take the same analog phone you've used for years, or indeed a DECT phone environment, and just plug that straight into that socket. And instead of going out on the PSTN network, that goes into the router, it connects to the SIP service, and hey presto, you can make a call and receive calls in the way that you've already done. So hopefully a fairly straightforward solution there. I've also showcased on the right there our latest business class model called the Viga 2865. We did the release actually last week, so some of you may have heard that. If you look at any DrayTek router and look at the variant that's got a VAC after it or a V after it, this also has a telephone port available. I think current setup allows you to connect 2 phones. Excuse me, just need a slurp of water. Yeah, you can plug up to 2 phones in that, and again use that in the same way as that BT Home Hub. So the good news is you can keep all your old phones. It works with all DECT. Plug your DECT base station into that, and hey presto, you've got it working around your home or office. So hopefully quite a straightforward transition there. I'll also just add something else, maybe to sort of better topologically explain what's going on. We've got a kind of back of a kind of router there. In this case, we've got an ADSL connection going from this router. This now goes to, as you've newly learned, a SOTAP service. The service of ADSL that doesn't have this analog line associated with it. And as you can see in the ISP world, traffic gets broken out into the internet to a SIP trunk, which goes into what will be currently this PSTN network, which obviously will be different in the future. And indeed, all data will be broken out for websites, streaming services, and so on. So you've got that one connection to the internet, and then you've got the concept of, on the left, the analog phone, which will connect to the analog phone port on the router. But also to say that you can also plug IP phones into this as well. So they will just go into a normal LAN port that's in this case on the router, or it could be on a switch, a PoE switch or something, to power your IP phone. And indeed, you know, PCs, laptops, other Wi-Fi would also apply to that. So point to make here is you can certainly retain your old analog phones with the right router, but also you could introduce new IP phones to the environment as well. So hopefully that kind of pulls together the different options that you may want to use. So we've also got individuals. It's probably going to be more of a niche requirement there. There could be those that don't really want broadband, but they do want to retain an IP, want to retain a phone, not an IP phone, a phone. So we think it's likely, again, we're not 100% on this, this is just our interpretation. We think it's unlikely that some ISPs may offer a modem which has got VoIP on it, and this is just an example of what it might look like. You've got a power supply there, you've got a port that goes onto effectively the broadband connection, and you've got a phone port there to plug in an analog phone. So we think it is possible that you may be able to get a service such as that if someone just literally wants a phone line but doesn't want internet. Fairly unusual, I think, but it may well be that that's the case. So just some other considerations that you may want to take into account. Clearly, with the current setup of an analog phone line as an over-the-top service, completely separate to broadband, if you like, that phone call can just take place unimpeded. When you're effectively combining the voice, converting it into IP and putting it over the internet, it's now contending for all the other things that are going up and down the line. So I'm sure everybody can relate to this at home. You've got, you know, streaming services, you've got various people using the internet for a whole raft of reasons, and that voice call will now start to get combined and start to conflict with all those other services coming up and down the line. You know, best phone system in the world can sound absolutely terrible if there's too much congestion on the line. So one of the things that is a key consideration on anybody using voice over IP over the internet, obviously will be especially relevant when analog phones are turned off, is you need to make sure voice has the right priority, has the right class of service, as we call it, across the internet. So if you look at that graphic there, you can see a very simple implementation of quality of service. I think we got a kind of example here of kind of social media. We've got an example of sort of office systems, and we've got the example of VoIP there. So what we'd recommend is voice has the highest priorities. In other words, that will hog the bandwidth it needs to have a really effective call. So hopefully you'll get a very, very good quality call if you do that. Obviously there are options available. We're very strong on QoS on a DrayTek router. So a DrayTek router combined with that kind of voice connection could be a very, very good solution for those of you wanting to maintain a very high standard of voice. So kind of in summary, I just want to quote some of the resources we got available. So I really encourage you to read a blog. Actually, there's two blogs we've got on our DrayTek website. These were written by Michael Spalter. Some of you know him or have heard of him. He founded our organisation sort of 20 years ago in the UK and has been there right the way through the implementation of ISDN and all the rest of it. So quite an author on this subject. There are two blogs there entitled The End of Analogue Lines, which I really encourage you to read. You can find out more information on what I've spoken about today, and actually there's a lot more information there as well. You can see that on that particular URL. And if you go onto the draytek.co.uk website and just click the knowledge base and then blog articles, these two blogs are the first things that you'll see. We've also, as you probably imagined, extracted quite a lot of bit of information from BT on this. It's BT that's making the changes. So as I said in my opening statement there, we've done our best to glean information that's publicly available to share with you in this concise form. You can see you've got links there to Sagia, Sogfast and SOTAP, the new kind of broadband services without analog lines that I mentioned earlier on. And there's also a bit of a section on WLR, wholesale line rental withdrawal, again I referenced previously. So I think that's me pretty much run out of puff now. So I hope you found that useful. As I say, this webinar has been recorded. It will be available for streaming in the future. Some interesting articles that you can see with some links to. We very much do welcome feedback on this. And I think, I believe Alex is joining us now, who I think has been leading the team that have been answering various questions. So now, Alex, if you want to come in now, maybe we can share some of the key questions that have come about on this webinar today.
Hi, Julian. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you fine, yeah.
Thanks, Julian. Yes, there's been lots of very varied questions. It's been quite good, quite different to some of the other webinars with the nature of the topic, and there's lots of different angles that people are looking at this from. As you've covered, it's quite wide-ranging in the potential impact with withdrawing the PSTN, because it's used for so many things, not only voice but also for the broadband. So I've got some questions that we can answer over the audio. I think they're quite some interesting ones, so we can start with some of the ones that we've received. So one is about replacing existing systems. You kind of touched on this a bit, but let me just repeat. So one question is that someone's got a kind of complex internal analog phone system which is integrated to all sorts of other functions. So you can imagine things like door releases, intercoms, that and call bump, that sort of thing. And replacing this is going to be quite technically challenging and quite expensive. So the question is kind of what are the options likely to be? What will people be able to do? So the answer on this is kind of a yes, it is quite a challenging thing. I think depending on the different circumstances, certainly with people who've got ISDN30 and lots of lines coming in, I can see that it can be quite a challenge to work out how to move that across to non-PSTN type based, non-analog based services. So with one solution we believe is going to be kind of analog terminal adapters, which will take a VoIP connection in using the existing broadband connection and then provide some sort of analog signal to the analog device. So we believe this approach would be used quite widely, but there'll be, I think, a limit to how much this scales up, because I think that if you've got a larger system that has many lines, I think in practice it will be a case of replacing it with a full IPpbx will be a kind of common approach. And there are also hybrid PBXs that have been around for a while now that support both analog and VoIP. And in some cases, some of the existing PBXs that might be deployed may have modules that you can add VoIP onto it. And
I was just going to say there, I mean, clearly this is happening. It's going to happen over quite a protracted period of time, as I've advised, and I'm quite sure all the good decent suppliers that have put this type of solution in are going to be all over this, and we'll be coming up with options, I'm sure. And I think obviously the recommendation is if you've got a particular system that you're using, hopefully that particular supplier will have a good solution to you, which should be there for consideration.
Yes, and what we've seen is that there are now kind of IP-based equivalents of those sort of systems. So, for example, your intercom systems, there's a lot of IP-based ones now, door releases, call buttons, those sort of things now have VoIP versions of those. So I can see that those will kind of be replaced, but it's something that will take time, I think, to replace a lot of the legacy systems. So that's that. So
okay.
Another question is quite an interesting one. There's been a lot of questions relating to this on the chat, which is to do with emergency services, because if the I mean, I know a lot of us now take mobiles for granted, so often that would be the first thing someone would reach for in an emergency situation, but there's still the need for some sort of fixed line in many situations, especially for vulnerable customers. So if someone is elderly, they're less likely to maybe have a mobile phone or be as familiar using it, and would want to go to what they're used to, which would be a kind of a fixed analog phone in their house. So there's a question about what's going to be the impact on that. And also in kind of systems like an example is in a lift. You know, you might have a phone in a lift. How will that be affected with the withdrawal of PSTN? So the answer to that is that if the PSTN is being withdrawn, then those circuits ultimately eventually won't exist anymore. So it would have to be based along some sort of VoIP system in the long run. There's some guidance that Ofcom are updating on the responsibilities of a provider to provide a phone system that provides adequate provision in the event of a power failure. So there's going to be some sort of battery backup deployed, I think, by different providers in the industry, and the exact approach will depend on the circumstances. So I think that for a vulnerable customer that requires a phone in their home, I think the approach will be slightly different to sort of the example of where there's a lift. And in some situations, you might find that although the PSTN's been withdrawn, so the analog isn't there, you could still run analog in some parts of the internal wiring. So for a lift, you could have analog running to that analog phone, but then have some sort of analog terminal adapter that converts the VoIP signal to analog, that then delivers that last little bit. But I think that there will be different areas of industry that have different approaches, and that their Ofcom will be leading the kind of regulations on that, and what their guidance is for all the different areas. But it will be the responsibility ultimately of the service providers.
Sure.
So another question here is about the kind of impact of withdrawal of the PSTN. I think some of the, if you're, because PSTN is where the broadband is used over, so if that line goes, a lot of the questions we had coming in were about what will be the impact on broadband, which I think you covered with the different products there, so I won't repeat that entirely. But one of them, the question was, is there any potential for an increase in speed? Because with DSL, the analog frequencies which you have voice over can't be used for the broadband connection. So the question is, can the removal of the PSTN allow DSL speeds to increase? And the answer to that is, in theory, it would be possible, but in practice, it's quite difficult to do, because there's a kind of a national access network frequency plan, which dictates what frequencies can be used for different services, and across the whole frequency spectrum, it kind of has different services that can be used for different frequencies. And although if you're removing the voice, that means that those frequencies might potentially be used, it's actually quite difficult to remove it from the whole network. And also there might be other systems where those frequencies can interfere with, maybe used by emergency services or MOD or police or something, that then make it more difficult, or traffic control, that make it difficult to use it. So I think in practice it probably means that those frequencies won't actually be used for DSL services. And in the longer term, the goal is to move to full fibre anyway, so it's probably will be a transition eventually over the longer term to
they're probably unlikely to invest in technology that embraces that for that reason. That's a very good question, that.
Yeah. So that's kind of some of the questions I've got so far over the chat. We could look at some more if we've got time.
Yeah, we kind of allowed, I think, 45 to 50. So there's any other typical question we could potentially take. I think we've got quite a few people on the call today, so I think taking individuals is going to be difficult. So maybe there's just one other, Alex, that might have been a common one. We can try and cover that as well.
Yes, the question about kind of the voice on the product. So do DrayTek have plans for supplying more voice routers? It's a question as with the analog terminal adapters in them.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So I think if you look at our range does include the voice as an option. It's funny because when we first brought out the voice version, it was the VAC version of the product. It was at a time when it was quite expensive to make a PSTN call, so there was actually a financial reason for not making a call over the PSTN and doing it on SIP instead. And then the market changed, and you kind of got telephone calls bundled in for free, didn't you? Really, or effectively for free. So the benefit of having that was reduced, but actually it could mean that there's a bit of resurgence actually in demand for that type of solution. So if you look at the 2700 series and the 2800 series, which are our two most popular routers, there is a VAC option. So 2765 VAC, 2865 VAC, that will have this phone port capability, and we will supply as much as the market demands. We have access to this product that we can order as and when. So if there's a demand, we will certainly supply. You can be rest assured on that one.
Yes,
okay, Alex.
Yes, let's have a look at. There's another question I was going to ask.
So make this the last one, I think, Alex, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah.
So there's some questions about what exchanges are going to be the ones that have the first kind of stop sells on. So I think there's a link we'll be able to send in the follow-up that has some further information, because Openreach have a list of which exchanges they've got stop sells on. So that's something for some of the people who have asked that about which ones, and it's going to be a staggered approach. So it's not going to be a date where every single exchange, there'll be kind of tranches of it. It looks like they're doing kind of around 50 a time with each of their approaches as they're developing the rollout.
Yeah, I'm sure the rollouts will change and evolve as well as time goes by. So good. All right, Alex. Well, so Alex is our CTO, by the way. So I didn't introduce you properly. My apologies, Alex. So thank you very much for coming in with all those questions and with some superb answers there. So just to summarise, thank you very much for attending today. It's great to see so many of you on the webinar. So I think one of our more popular ones. So it's good to see this was of interest. Really hope you find that useful. Please do look at the blogs. Please do pass us your feedback, and we wish you a great and safe day. Bye for now.